this is both highly ironic and deeply misleading. These students are actually quite often highly attentive to many aspects of their current experience. It's just that the scope of that attention is broad. Recall the naturalist Jack Lawless, who seemed highly distracted in the classroom, where narrow and highly selective focus was required. In contrast, he was able to sit in silence for many hours in the forest, observing the actions of the natural environment as they unfolded around him. The same ability to narrow focus and limit our awareness of most of our environment that benefits rote learning is a significant handicap for error and experience-based learning. Rather than labeling the attentional tuning of our more broadly attentive students as pathological, we should provide them with learning experiences that are more suited to their strengths than simply barraging them with semantic details. It is also simply not the case that a tight attentional focus is an unlimited good, and a more diffuse focus a handicap. Each has benefits in different settings. For the D-strength system we've been speaking of, a somewhat looser and broader focus is preferred, and too narrow and tight a focus is a handicap. Research has shown that in most individuals, increasing the activity of the cognitive control systems in the brain's frontal lobes, leading to tighter attentional focus, decreases the activity of their default mode network. As a result, the activities that depend on this network, such as mental simulation, creativity, imagination, and many higher-order problem-solving functions, also decrease. In contrast, in individuals who score highest on tests of creativity, this attention-cost inhibition of default mode network activity does not occur. Instead, these individuals can ramp up both their attentional and their default mode network engagement at the same time, giving them an ideal balance of creativity and control. If you think back to our description of error-driven learning, you can see how important this ability to simultaneously stimulate both attention and default mode activity might be, since the surprise induced by mistaken predictions leads to increases both in attention and in default mode network activity. That's why being somewhat resistant to the usual inhibitory effects of focused attention may be useful for all mind strengths, as they all rely on default mode network activity. This also aligns with the study we cited in Chapter 15, which shows an inverse relationship in Harvard alumni between tight attentional focus and real-world creative achievement. How error-driven learning can correct our educational mistakes. It is simply not possible to overstate the significance of these findings for individuals with dyslexia. Dyslexic minds are quite literally built to delight in learning from experience. From building models of the world, making predictions, and testing those predictions through further interactions and experiences. The implications of this simple truth for the education and working lives of dyslexic individuals are profound, and the often repeated mistake of treating this bias toward active engagement with the world as a weakness rather than a potential strength is in urgent need of correction. Dyslexic minds are fundamentally built to gather and use experience in creative and imaginative ways through the application of the mind strengths. Each individual will vary in the skill with which they employ the different mind strengths, depending on their abilities and interests. Some will be stronger with spatial or mechanical reasoning, others with creatively linking remote ideas or concepts, and still others with weaving verbal narratives, creating visual arts, solving complex problems, predicting future events, or dealing well with changing situations. The mind strengths are all built upon a set of common brain systems and perform their functions by remembering and creating detailed mental models of physical and conceptual worlds, both real and imagined, and by using those models for mental simulation, construction, prediction, and other high-level functions. Dyslexic minds are engaged by the surprising, the new, the difficult, the complex, by tasks that require imagination and problem-solving more than recollection and efficient application of rules or procedures, by deep understanding rather than fluent rote recall, by questions like, given what you know, what would you predict, rather than what was the name, date, place, definition of blank. We'll explore the implications of these differences for school and work in the coming chapters. D Strengths in Action, Yoki Matsuoka. Throughout this book, we've likened the experience of living as an individual with dyslexia to be a condition, where different aspects of the dyslexic experience can be likened to different conditions, such as slow or temperature. Let's think of visibility. Imagine that your visibility was limited by a fog so thick that it prevented you from even realizing you were on the mountain at all. Then imagine that you spent the first 40 plus years of your life enveloped by that fog, until one day, suddenly, it lifted, and you finally realized where you stood. For Yogi Matsuoka, pioneering engineer, computer scientist, roboticist, technologist, and entrepreneur, that moment of revelation came in the office of a neuropsychologist, where the third of her 4 children was being evaluated. He was in the 3rd grade, and he was very bright, but with his reading, he had just completely fallen off the train. So we took him to a neuropsych evaluation course, and I was allowed to sit behind him on some of the evaluation. And the very first moment I realized that he and I had the same problem, was when they started testing phonemic awareness, or how to manipulate word sounds. And he was having a hard time. And I was having a hard time right behind him. And I thought it was really terrible that I could not manipulate the sounds back and forth. So that's when I realized that I had a problem. And I mentioned this to the guy who was doing the evaluation. I said, I couldn't do those problems. And he said, oh, it's common that some parents find out through these tests that they also have dyslexia. And I was like, oh my God. But then my brain went, this really makes sense. Because I had always wondered why, as a child growing up in Japan, it had been so hard for me to read. I was always so embarrassed to read in front of the class. It seemed like I could do so many other things pretty well, but this was something that I was much worse at than everybody else. I did as much as I could, so I would not be called upon in the classroom. And when they called, I felt like everybody was giving them everything all the time. And when I was reading or learning English as a language, it was so much harder for me than for anybody else. I had some problems memorizing my multiplication tables, but beyond that, math and physics were so easy for me. Like, no problem. But then when it came to digesting letters or for literature, it was so hard. And now it finally made sense. It also made sense to my father. My mom used to yell at my dad for not reading newspapers and saying, we don't even know anything about the world because we don't read newspapers. And it was true. He never read anything. But he was also a very intelligent man who was a successful land developer and urban planner. He came up with new ideas on how to develop cities and how to rebuild Tokyo after World War II so it would function like a modern city. He also was a Fulbright scholar, and he went to MIT to study. And then he went back to Japan as a key developer of the Tsukuba Science City, which to this day is a major research center. He was pretty much a typical dyslexia idea man. He could see the big picture. I ended up coming to the United States in high school because I was one of the top-ranked women student players in Japan, and I wanted to be a professional tennis player. After spending 2 years at a prestigious tennis academy, Yoki got a scholarship to the University of California, but a series of injuries ended her competitive tennis career. Fortunately, by that time, she had found new passions at Berkeley: math, science, and engineering, particularly the engineering of robots. After graduating from Berkeley with a degree in electrical engineering and computer science, Yoki enrolled in the graduate program in robotics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she worked in the laboratory of Rodney Brooks on the famous Cog robot project, whose aim was to create robots that were more human-like in their abilities to interact with and learn from their environments. Yoki chose to work on the arms and hands, and she threw herself wholeheartedly into the task. I tend to get really intense and passionate about things, and when I started working on that, I began looking around at robots in industry and assembly lines, and they were just horrible. Most state-of-the-art robots use pinching grips to do grasping functions, and they still do. They can be very precise, but they have zero chance of ever becoming a human-level laundry folding. That's how it was in the 1980s when I first started noticing robots, and they're still doing the same thing now in the 2020s. And I thought, as long as we're approaching it in that way, we're never going to get to the point where we are able to build more general-purpose robots. They're trying to solve a fundamentally different problem that has nothing to do with human fingers. And it occurred to me that one of the big problems in the field is that most of the people who were working on it were simply enjoying the math and trying to solve engineering problems. But they weren't really trying to design something that could replicate that. And I thought, what impact is that going to make on the world? So that's when I said, you know what? Forget it. I know that nobody will like what I'm going to do. But you know, I've got to figure out why we have this amazing hand that apparently differentiates us from the monkeys and all the other species so that we could build the tools that built the society and made us so adaptable. And I thought, we've got to find out how hands really work, or we'll never be able to build something that works as good. So that was really my foundation. And then, as you said, you know, the more we dug, the more I discovered. And that was so incredible. Yoki began to study the ways that human arms and hands actually performed their tasks. She carefully analyzed not only the mechanical components like bones, muscles, ligaments, and tendons, but also the neural systems that directed these mechanical systems. As she did, her work led her deeper and deeper into the study of neuroscience, anatomy, and physiology, and she was fascinated by what she learned. In a way, that was a bit of a shock. I had always hated biology in high school. It was just meaningless. My teachers didn't connect the information to anything, and I never did well on tests. It was just like geography, just a bunch of lists that I would cram to remember and then forget the next day. But in my studies now, I started to understand how the human body could be viewed as a kind of mechanical system, with the brain controlling the physical system, which was living in a physical environment. And I could understand all this using the engineering principles I was already good at and using the same math. Once those connections were there, everything fell into place. And then, the more I dug, the more I discovered. And that was so incredible. After earning her PhD, Yogi spent 2 years as a postdoctoral student at Harvard, then spent the next decade in faculty positions, first at Carnegie Mellon and then at the University of Washington. Her work flourished, and despite her youth, she became known as one of the pioneers in the new field of neurobotics, which works to bring insights from neuroscience into robotics. In 2007, Yogi was awarded a MacArthur Genius Award for her remarkable work. But despite her undoubted success, Yogi began to feel out of place in the academic world. I've always been that funny boundary breaker. It's not that I don't see the boundaries. It's just that I don't understand why people have them. When I got these tenure-track jobs, I was fascinated by neuroscience and fascinated by robotics, and I was publishing in each area. But they were like, no, you've got to pick just one like everyone else. And I thought that was so silly. They really couldn't figure out what department I belonged in. But I just didn't see it that way. I chased what I needed to know. I mean, electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, the math was the same. One was applied to electrons and the other to physical things. So they felt very interchangeable. And computer science to me was just a tool to be able to do things. And neuroscience and physiology, I could understand them like engineering systems. And to me, it just never made sense to try to put boundaries between these. I also realized I was writing papers on things that would be important 30 years from now, but I wanted to make an impact on the world for people right now. So, in 2009, despite her meteoric rise up the academic ranks, Yogi left academia to become head of innovation at Google, where she was also one of the co-founders of Google X and pioneered the development of the energy-saving Nest thermostat. During the next decade, Yogi held key positions at several other leading tech companies, including Apple, Twitter, and Qantas. She also held a board position at Hewlett-Packard. Yogi became known as one of the founders of the health tech revolution for her innovative work blending engineering, artificial intelligence, and the biological sciences. As she told us, I've always felt like whenever I find something interesting to work on, it's going to become a new trend in the world. Like when I combined neuroscience and robotics, and then suddenly there was a field, and it's now one of the most popular engineering majors. And then I combined neuroscience and artificial intelligence and health, and you have health tech. And now it feels like everyone is working on it. I think I've always seen a big enough picture and could just see what the next trend might be. And pouncing on it is really fun. Most recently, her experience trying to balance life during the stay-at-home days of the COVID epidemic as a mother of 4 children, 2 with dyslexia, while simultaneously heading up a new independently led subsidiary of Panasonic and serving as their managing executive director, has had Yogi pouncing in a whole new direction. Yogi's new venture, Johanna, matches busy families with an actual human Yo assistant, who, backed by sophisticated technology resources, helps with otherwise time-draining tasks like setting appointments, finding and scheduling repair people for the house or the car, scheduling travel, and handling many other tasks. Yogi has also found that the same predictive power that has allowed her to spot trends is very valuable in her management roles as well. I don't know, again, whether it's dyslexia, but definitely the things that I see are a little bit ahead of the times. So whether it's a personal conflict or who's really going to be able to support a certain part of the organization, I can usually spot it ahead of time. Yogi also shared a frequent experience that many of our visionary entrepreneurs have related, which echoes the results of the mind strengths question on nonlinear thinking. A lot of people can't understand the things that I can clearly foresee coming in my mind when I describe them. I try to explain what I see, but I realize that the way I'm describing it still may not completely make sense to them. Then months pass, and what I've seen finally happens, and finally they can see it too, and then we can connect the dots. So sometimes now, even though I wish I could describe it, I just say, let's do it, because it can save us a lot better. From that point of view, as a CEO, I now get to do a bit of the Steve Jobs thing of like, I know you don't believe it yet, but we're doing it this way. And usually they're fine, but still, it's really interesting how at the higher level, some sort of a connection takes place that makes things super obvious to me, but which takes a lot more time to reach logically, or even to explain to other people. This different way of thinking has always made Yogi feel like it was hard for others to really grasp what she was thinking and seeing. Even when I was a kid in Japan, some of my friends from those days will tell me now, you never really fit in here. You were a bit different. And in college and graduate school, people couldn't really understand what I was talking about a lot of the time. I think that's part of the reason I went into robotics. When I just described things I was thinking, they were like, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. But no one seems to really get it. But when I actually started building things, then they could see the differences in the abilities that the robots have. And they're like, now I totally understand what you meant. And that's a good idea, right? Because the robots I built were totally different from anybody else's. And that is revolutionizing and moving the needle. But for a lot of my life, I felt so different. And I never had confidence in myself. I always felt terrible about myself, really. I felt like I was always trying to hide. And always trying to pretend that I wasn't dumb, so that no one knew how hard I was trying. And that really continued all the way until I was in robotics. And then the MIT professor said to me, "No, you're good. Believe in yourself." And finally, I was like, well, maybe I can. Maybe it's okay. But it took that long for me to start to believe. Yoki has decided to use what she has learned about dyslexia and herself to help children who are dyslexic deal with their learning challenges earlier and more effectively, and to build from the beginning the self-confidence that came so late for her. Through her nonprofit, Yoki Works, which she founded using the money that came with her MacArthur Prize, Yoki and her family are working to improve early identification and access to intervention for students with dyslexia, to enable them to fulfill their hopes and dreams. It is a beautiful vision from an amazing dyslexic mind who now enjoys the fantastic outcome that her own journey up the mountain has provided. Part 7. Bringing the dyslexic advantage to life. 31. Exploratory strengths of the dyslexic mind. In the previous chapters, we've described the mind strengths, or the common patterns of mental abilities that we've observed in dyslexic individuals. These strengths, rather than challenges with reading, spelling, and other fine detail skills, are the true core features of dyslexia, and they carry great benefits for those who possess them. Recently, a remarkable scientist, who introduced herself to us not long after the first edition of this book was released, has published her own theory on the benefits of dyslexia. Using approaches borrowed from a broad array of different disciplines, she has proposed that dyslexic minds create benefits not only for those who have such minds, but also for humanity as a whole. In fact, she convincingly argues that dyslexic minds are critical for the ability of the human community as a whole to adapt to a changing and variable world. In the sections that follow, this remarkable scientist and dyslexic thinker will share with us the fascinating and important new theory she's developed about the role of dyslexic minds. Dyslexia and the theory of complementary cognition. Helen Taylor is an archaeologist by training, with a PhD from the University of Cambridge. However, any effort to narrow Helen's full range of interests and expertise to a single professional domain will be entirely futile, because Helen is a perfect example of interconnected reasoning. In addition to a profoundly interdisciplinary mind, Helen also displays a deep intellectual tenacity and passion to pursue the questions that interest her. In recent years, the questions that have most sparked Helen's interest relate to dyslexic minds. Helen has developed a detailed theory that casts new light on the value of dyslexic minds, both for those who have them and for humanity as a whole. Helen's theory of complementary cognition is rooted in the understanding that humans adapt primarily through culture, by exploring, refining, and consolidating behaviors and inventions that contribute to our survival. Helen's theory states that humans are cognitively specialized in different but complementary learning strategies that underlie this process of cultural adaptation. These strategies lie along a continuum from global search or exploration of unknown information to local search or exploitation of existing knowledge. To adapt, humans must identify problems in current knowledge and update their behavior and inventions. Helen's theory proposes that collaboration among individuals who fall across this continuum of learning strategies, from exploration to exploitation, results in the creation of higher quality solutions to the challenges of adaptation, solutions not otherwise obtainable from an individual or from a group of similar individuals. This superior effectiveness of collaboration makes us interdependent. People with different abilities must work effectively together to adapt and solve problems successfully. In a recent research article, Helen outlined evidence showing that people with dyslexia specialize in exploration. This enhanced ability comes as a trade-off to exploitation-related skills, such as those needed in reading and writing, e.g., fluent application of rules for decoding, spelling, syntax, and mechanics. Therefore, within the theoretical framework of complementary cognition, dyslexia can be viewed not as a disorder, but rather as a mismatch between a learning strategy and the ability to read and write. To help explain the theory in more depth, we asked Helen to describe to us how she developed her ideas. Helen's interest in dyslexia had its origins in her own experiences as a dyslexic person. Though she was not formally diagnosed until college, Helen struggled throughout her education with difficulties in reading, writing, orienting letters correctly, listening to lectures, organizing materials, managing her time, memorizing by rote, and in general, learning anything in the way it was taught, or demonstrating her knowledge in the expected forms. It was only by using every available moment, including lunch breaks, to do her schoolwork, and gradually discovering how to teach herself to understand what she was learning, often through the use of drawings, that she was able to get by. However, when she eventually reached the university level, the demands from her coursework exceeded her strategies for coping, and she finally received psychoeducational testing. The diagnosis of dyslexia that Helen received provided her with an immediate explanation for her struggles, but over the months that followed, it led slowly to a recognition that this explanation was both incomplete and misleading. When I first got diagnosed with dyslexia, I was struggling so much that I thought I had something seriously wrong with me. It wasn't until a little while later, when I was studying the invention of writing, that I began to question the idea of dyslexia as a disability. I realized that writing had always been my biggest problem. I just can't get my ideas into words or into an ordered structure, and it drives me insane. But I also realized that writing was primarily a problem because I couldn't get things that in my mind were all interconnected in 3 dimensions down into a linear sequence on paper. And I thought, if that's my problem, then it's a strange sort of problem, because I also realized that my thoughts were often quite original and that I can always figure things out. And the reason I could was because I could make all these connections. So I thought, how can I have a disability if the thing that's making writing so difficult is also the thing that's helping me figure things out? Also, I began to wonder how would you consider a difficulty using technology to be a disability? Because that's what writing is. It's a very recent human invention. Written language is really the only cultural invention for which we assume that difficulty with use constitutes some kind of deficit. If someone isn't good at, say, accounting or computer programming, we don't assume they have a neurobiological disorder, but we do that with reading and writing. So that's when I started questioning the whole idea that dyslexia should be seen as a disability, and I began to look for a better way to think about it. At that time, around the year 2000, the only alternative view I could find was an article on visual communication in art students. Instead, I started to question all my friends and ask them what was going on inside their heads. I'd give them an activity and I'd ask, what does your brain do? What do you see? Or if you come across this problem, how do you approach it? I just interrogated them on how their brains worked for years, and I started forming my own ideas on what some of the different strengths, including the strengths that dyslexic people seem to have, and made lists of them. And about that time, your book, The Dyslexic Advantage, also came out. And that was also very exciting, because it aligned so well with the ideas I've been forming. For example, your interconnected reasoning was precisely what I've been calling networked thinking. In the process of all this questioning, one of the things that I discovered was that my best friend was in many ways the opposite of me. She had a much more schematic view of things. So when I asked her about what she thought about when I said brain, she said she thought about a simple grayscale drawing of a brain, whereas my mental image was much more like a real brain, with color and weight and texture and all those features. She's very detail-oriented, and this was reflected in her talents for writing, art, and music. She paints very realistic pictures, and composes and plays fast guitar solos that require hours and hours of practice. She also didn't have any problems with reading, but then she'd struggle with things I found easy. For example, she'd get lost very easily because she had no mental map of where she'd been. Whereas once I'd walked somewhere, I just know my way around and quickly develop a map of the landscape so I can simulate a flying through of the area and decide what would be the best route. So there were all these things one of us could do and the other couldn't, and vice versa. So that we made a very good team, but we were also very different. And I realized, in fact, that we were complementary. And it really struck me that perhaps this kind of complementarity among people wasn't simply an accident, but that it might point to something very important. I mentioned this idea of specialization to my friend Pablo, who was an economist, and he gave me a paper that discussed the benefits of the division and specialization of labor and the importance of effective cooperation. That became a very important part of my thinking. But this idea of specialized thinkers also caused me a problem, because I thought, if we're specialized, then what are we specialized in? So I tried to find a pattern among all the different strengths I had identified and read about, and I spent ages thinking about that. But my mind also kept going back to that economics paper, because it discussed not just one, but 2 key factors in improving productivity and efficiency. The first, which was the one I had thought primarily about, was specialization and collaboration. But the second was increasing general knowledge, and that's what eventually gave me the clue. I realized that the dyslexic strengths on the list I had made all dealt in one way or another with seeking knowledge about things that are unknown. So I thought, maybe that's what dyslexic strengths are focused on, seeking and dealing with the unknown, as opposed to focusing on capitalizing on the known. I began to wonder, how do I verify whether people with dyslexia are specialized in exploring new opportunities? Then, one day when I was walking, I realized that this balance between using existing and creating new information is what we see in adaptive evolution itself, with a small number of mutations to provide new opportunities within the larger background of stability. So I continued to look for more examples of known and unknown trade-offs in systems that adapt, until eventually I came across complex systems theory. Then I read a book by Scott Page, where he said, the trade-off between exploration and exploitation arises often in complex systems. And I thought, that's it. That's what I'm talking about. In complex systems theory, the idea of exploration refers to activities that are oriented towards searching for new opportunities, resources, or rewards, while exploitation refers to sticking with opportunities and resources that are already known and have so far proved rewarding. Maintaining an optimal balance between exploration and exploitation at the whole system level is critical for successful adaptation and survival. As Helen has written, Exploring endlessly without exploiting what has been found can be inefficient, whereas focusing too much on exploitation may be suboptimal or result in failure to adapt to change. This trade-off arises in many seemingly unrelated areas of endeavor, from evolution to economy to artificial intelligence. Helen went on. As I read through these papers, I learned that in complex self-adapting systems, this exploration-exploitation complementarity is seen as particularly useful in enabling systems to adapt to settings where the environment was especially variable. One well-studied example is the business environment, where research has examined the beneficial effects of mixing exploratory traits like innovation and experimentation with exploitative ones like increasing efficiency and focus for success. Applying these ideas to my earlier research, I realized that one thing that complex human systems definitely need in order to adapt to variable and uncertain environments is to be continually exploring and updating their information to ensure that they're maintaining the optimum level of exploitation. And to do that, it is clear that at least some of their members will need to be focused on what is currently unknown. Helen's first goal was to ensure ideas could avoid one obvious disconfirmation. I created a testable hypothesis. If exploratory cognition really is an adaptive response to variability, then we should expect to find that the environment in which humans evolved was highly variable. To test that hypothesis, I started looking back at the paleo-environmental evidence, and what I found was that the most recent 6 million years, and especially the last 400,000 during which humans evolved, have seen the most dramatic climate variability of any period since the extinction of the dinosaurs. So that aligned perfectly with my prediction. Now I really felt that I was onto something, and my next step was to determine at a cognitive level where there was any evidence supporting the idea that dyslexic brains were, in fact, geared toward exploration. Since the brain is also a complex adaptive system, I looked into the literature to see whether anyone had studied cognition from that perspective. That's how I found the field of cognitive search. Cognitive search investigates how our minds, or more recently, artificially intelligent machines, look for resources relevant to our current interests or needs, either in our minds or in the outside world. I studied that work, as well as all the research on dyslexia in different areas of cognition, to see whether it all aligned with this exploratory pattern, and I found that the evidence very much supported the idea that dyslexia is an exploratory specialization, which is oriented towards seeking the unknown. For example, the lower working memory capacity most individuals with dyslexia share tends to be associated with a preference for global or large-scale search strategies, rather than local or fine detailed exploration. Lower working memory is also associated with insight-based problem solving, which is closely related to exploratory search. Enhanced divergent creativity, like that found in dyslexic adults, is beneficial for exploratory behavior. By promoting the retention of conscious access to information, i.e. conscious compensation, the automatization deficit found in many people with dyslexia may make it easier to modify and integrate information, thereby facilitating innovation. The broader and less focused fields of sensory attention found in dyslexic individuals in areas like vision and hearing favor global rather than local search. The use of episodic memory systems for mental simulation is inherently exploratory in nature. The broader mini-cognitive spacing found in dyslexic individuals favors global over local processing and exploratory behavior. So my conclusion based on all this data was that the exploratory model for dyslexic cognition, with corresponding trade-offs in exploitation or local processing, holds up very well. I think this pattern of complementary cognition is so important because the trade-off between exploration and exploitation that has resulted in different but complementary cognitive specializations among humans hasn't just been critical to our ability as a species to adapt to change in the past. It's equally essential for our present and future. This complementarity is simply not something we can ignore or neglect, because once a system's components have specialized like this, they become interdependent. So all ways of thinking become essential both to the individual and to the health and success of the whole. As a result of our exploitation-biased education system, we might be failing to recognize and understand the value of exploratory cognition, which will not only harm individuals with dyslexia and limit their opportunities, but will also weaken our collective ability as a species to thrive and adapt to change. In the long run, it'll be counterproductive if we continue to think of cognition exclusively in individual terms and insist that everyone become optimized for more exploitation-related skills. Instead, we need to think about cognitive search at the group level as well, and recognize that some people are simply tuned more toward exploring the unknown than exploiting existing. That is a good thing, not a disability. It's also what made the human species so adaptable. Ultimately, humans adapt to change primarily through culture, and if our cultures are to remain adaptive, they must support the growth and development of individuals who think in different but complementary ways. Ultimately, we humans are interdependent, and that means that whatever learning strategy we excel in, we must all collaborate effectively to collectively adapt and solve our problems. Exploratory Strengths in Action. Bob Ballard. Dr. Robert Ballard is universally regarded as one of the great explorers of our age. Bob is best known to the general public as the discoverer of the resting place of the Titanic, as well as the finder of many other famous shipwrecks, including the German battleship Bismarck, John F. Kennedy's PT-109, and the Lusitania, a passenger ship whose sinking in 1915 by a German U-boat played an important role in drawing the United States into involvement in World War I. Yet these famous discoveries are only a minor part of Bob's contributions to our understanding of the deep seas. Early in his career, Bob provided definitive evidence in support of the theory of plate tectonics, revolutionizing geology. He discovered the first deep-sea hydrothermal vents, and with them, stunning new life forms that have opened up entirely new fields in biology and biochemistry. He has combined oceanographic and archaeological techniques to find and explore shipwrecks in the Mediterranean and Black Seas from as far back as the Canaanite era, circa 2000 BC, helping to rewrite the history of ancient navigation and commerce. And he has used his military background in the ocean floor to make major contributions to undersea defense strategy and submarine warfare. When looking over Bob's list of accomplishments, or better yet, reading or listening to his fascinating autobiography, Into the Deep, we find it almost impossible to believe that this list describes the work of a single person. It is even harder for many people to believe that a person so remarkable has written about himself. I've always felt insecure, deep down, about my brains and ability. Even with all the success I've had, I've never been able to shake the fear that I was like a boxer trying to fight opponents in a higher weight class. Bob attributes this lifelong insecurity to the problems with reading and writing he experienced as a student, and to the difficulty he felt in measuring up to his academically talented older brother. He was told he was hyperkinetic, but it felt to him as if school were a sort of straitjacket, and he struggled from the beginning to keep up with the required reading. When his family moved from Kansas to California, and Bob entered 5th grade, it was clear that he was far behind. His mother worked with him to build his organizational skills and improve his focus, but he still received a D for reading on his report card. Bob's parents arranged for him to have daily tutoring, and while that began to help, what really caused him to buckle down and improve his school performance was an event that gave him something that tutoring couldn't: motivation. At the age of 12, Bob attended a showing of Disney's film adaptation of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That experience changed his life. He realized in a way he never had before that there was a vast, three-dimensional world beneath the ocean's surface filled with unknown landscapes and creatures, just waiting to be explored. He suddenly knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be Captain Nemo. Bob now had a dream, and with that dream came the determination to do whatever was necessary to achieve it. He realized he would need good grades to pursue his goals, so he began to work as he never had before, and his grades began to rise. In high school, Bob volunteered during his summers to work with oceanographers from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Those experiences helped him confirm that oceanography was his path. He enrolled at the University of California at Santa Barbara, beginning an ambitious 5-year program in physical sciences that appealed to his broadly interdisciplinary sensibilities. He hoped that the degree would make him an attractive candidate for later admission to the PhD program at Scripps. However, his continued problems with reading and test taking, which held his SAT scores below 1,000, also caused problems in some of his classes. In classes like calculus and organic chemistry, he had trouble picturing in his mind the things the textbooks described in words, and he received low marks in these classes. By the time he finished his degree, he had pulled his grades up to a 3.0 average, but this was not high enough for Scripps. Bob's application was rejected. After a crushing bout of despair at his failure to achieve a long-cherished dream, Bob picked himself up and began looking for a plan B. He enrolled in a master's degree program at the University of Hawaii. Later in life, Bob looked back on this experience as one of the most valuable in his life. He realized that failure could be a learning lesson. Since then, I've grown to love failure. It's not something you should try to avoid, but rather embrace and learn from, and then beat. You don't go around it, you go through it. You get knocked down, and you lie there, and you go, wow, that was a hell of a shot. And then you dive back in. I failed lots of times, but I don't quit, so I always win. I learned to embrace failure as the greatest teacher. For 2 years, Bob returned to California and enrolled in a doctoral program in marine geology at the University of Southern California. It was 1967, and the Vietnam War was at its height. So soon, Bob, who had been an Army reservist in college, was called up to active military service. Given his training in oceanography, Bob received a transfer to the Navy and was assigned as a liaison between the Office of Naval Research and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. At Woods Hole, Bob began work on Alvin, a recently developed manned submersible deep-sea research vehicle, submarine, that was beginning to open up new and previously undreamed-of opportunities for undersea research and exploration. He was Captain Nemo at last. Over the next next few years, Bob became a tireless advocate for using Alvin in a wide variety of scientific and defense-related applications, and he was allowed to pursue the series of explorations that led to the remarkable series of findings mentioned earlier. In these years, the boundless energy, curiosity, and enthusiasm that made it hard for him to focus inside a classroom or in front of a textbook made him an ideal self-starter and problem solver. Once my career got going, I was always in motion, barreling from one project to another. By then, I believed that with hyper-focus and energy, I could overcome any challenge. It was not only Bob's energy and focus that led to his success. His highly interdisciplinary mind, deeply collaborative spirit, and insatiable desire to be always exploring the unknown, whether by visiting uncharted spaces or pushing for the development of new technologies, also played key roles. As he told us, the most exciting place in science is right at the cutting edge, at the place where the clear field meets the dark forest, and especially where two edges touch. That's where the lightning is. I think a lot of people are terrified of freedom, of the idea that no one's taking care of you. Sometimes I'll ask my students to define a vacuum, and one will say it's a free space where you can expand in any direction, and another will say it's the absence of air, so you'll suffocate. Not everyone likes that freedom, but I think we dyslexic are used to living alone in that free space, so we're not afraid of it. We're comfortable out exploring, and in fact we love those dark and lonely places, because that's where the excitement is, out where most people are afraid. I'm an explorer and a wanderer. When you're dyslexic, you're an outsider, and so you learn to wander outside the system. But you can get into trouble, because you tend to wander into other people's territory. Every group has these people that I call the guardians of the difference, because they think their job is to divide society up into bits. And the key is, can you get past the gatekeepers to get to the good people? I remember when I was at Stanford on sabbatical for a couple of years. Alan Cox was the dean of the College of Earth Sciences. They had about 9 different departments, and Alan told me, I've tracked the students that go through this system, and the ones that do well in life are the ones that go to seminars in departments other than their own to get new ideas. It's sort of like Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, where the peanut butter runs into the chocolate. My greatest successes have come through mixing different fields. In addition to his highly interconnected thinking style, Bob also benefited from strengths in spatial reasoning, mental simulation, and prediction. These have also played a critical role in leading to his success in the needle-in-a-haystack searches for undersea shipwrecks, where so many others have failed. For example, the insight that led to his finding the Titanic resulted from a process of mental simulation, in which Bob began with eyewitness accounts that described the ship as breaking into 2 large pieces before sinking. Bob imagined in his mind what would happen to the wreck's fragments during the more than 2-mile descent to the ocean bottom. He saw like a film in his mind that the heaviest pieces would go essentially straight down, but that the lighter bits, the ship's furnishings, baggage, and other pieces, would be pushed by the ocean current and would settle out like a lengthy comet stream on the ocean floor. As these images played out in his mind, Bob suddenly realized that he was searching for the larger fragments of the ship, whose combined lengths would total at most 883 feet. He should be searching for the debris trail, which would be a mile or more in length. This would vastly improve his chances of finding the Titanic, and that was exactly what happened. Even after he began to assemble his long list of accomplishments, Bob's nonlinear thinking style, based on mental simulation and prediction, often led him to think in ways that others could not easily follow. I love how people always say, "This idea you've got is crazy, though your last one was pretty good." And I say, "But don't you remember that you called that one crazy back then too?" Despite his many successes, one mystery continued to puzzle Bob, the mystery of his own mind. He knew he differed greatly from most others around him in the more visual way he approached his scientific research and his shipwreck searches. But he never understood the source of this difference, nor did he understand how a mind that struggled so hard to read and to channel its energy in the classroom could be so ideally suited to succeeding in so many complex real-world endeavors. The answer came quite literally from out of the blue. One day in March 2015, I was driving home from my office, and I heard a segment on the radio about a book called The Dyslexic Advantage. What I heard felt familiar. Could I have been dyslexic without even realizing it? I ordered the book that night, and when I began reading it, I couldn't put it down. Tears were streaming down my face. Here I was, 72 years old, and this book, finally, was explaining me to me. Even now, I think of it as my first autobiography. That's how much it mirrored who I am. As Bob told us recently, through your book and through my self-analysis, I've really embraced being dyslexic. Dyslexic advantage. Just seeing those 2 words close to one another made a statement in its own right, and that's what's so wonderful. I always knew I was different, but it was through hearing your interview on NPR and then reading your book that really showed me I wasn't alone. There's a lot of us out there. What an untapped resource. And it's made me even more dangerous, because now I really know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And I'm homing in on what I'm good at and having a ball dreaming stuff up. And it's also helped me realize why I've always loved working in teams. My wife, Barbara, is a producer, and she handles all the production details for our National Geographic specials and other projects, and negotiates contracts with a skill I could never muster. And together, we've become a sort of dynamic duo of exploration. Until recently, I've also had 5 full-time administrative assistants who help me with the day-to-day details in each of my major project areas. I found that I can't function without non-dyslexics. I need non-dyslexics to implement, and without that, I cannot operate. We all work best together. I wish everyone recognized that dyslexia has its advantages, and the best education is the one that brings those talents out in a child. For dyslexics, the printing press was our demise as far as education was concerned, because before that, learning was primarily through oral communication and doing, and demonstration and visualization. We need to be mobile. We need oral testing and other ways of evaluating us and letting us survive the educational system. I just survived by trickery, memorizing and time management and all that nonsense. But we need something better. We need an educational system that's sympathetic and understanding about dyslexia.